The mission was supposed to be quiet. Watch the road, count the vehicles, write it down, go home. Dax Mercer had done quiet missions before. He was good at quiet. Quiet didn't ask much of you. Quiet let you exist in the space between one breath and the next, without having to think about anything in particular. He sat in the tree line above the yawl corridor, with a Vrothi lieutenant named Keth, who smelled like copper and burnt pine, and who had, in the 4 hours they'd been sitting here, said exactly 3 words to him. Dax respected that. He said 2 words back. They understood each other fine. The Vrothi convoy moved below them on the road. 8 vehicles, standard formation. The aliens moved the way they did everything, with a kind of deliberate elegance that Dax found exhausting to watch. Even the way they drove looked like it had been choreographed. Then the ridge above the 3rd vehicle came apart. Not an explosion. Not quite. More like the rock face decided it was done being a rock face, and chose to be something else. Debris came down across the road, and the convoy folded on itself, and Keth was already moving, and Dax was already moving, and the Karathi fighters came out of the ground like they'd grown there. There were a lot of them. Keth said something in Vrothi that Dax didn't need translated. The Vrothi soldiers fought beautifully. That was the honest word for it. They moved in tight formations, called signals to each other in clipped tones, covered angles with the precision of people who had spent their whole lives learning exactly how to do this. Their blade work was clean, their shooting was cleaner. The Karathi didn't care about any of that. Dax stopped watching the Vrothi and started watching the Karathi, which was a different education. They weren't fighting to win a battle. They were fighting to reach something specific. One of the vehicles. They were pushing toward it with the kind of organized pressure that meant they'd always known it was there. He didn't know what was in it. Keth took a shot to the chest and went down, and the Vrothi formation lost its shape. And Dax stopped thinking about tactics and started moving. He moved wrong. He knew he moved wrong. He'd been told, professionally, by 3 separate Vrothi officers in the joint briefings, that his combat movement was difficult to interpret and strategically unclear. He took that as a compliment. Unclear things were hard to shoot. He went low and used a dead fighter as cover, a Karathi fighter, which made the nearest Vrothi soldier flinch with something that was probably a cultural reaction Dax didn't have time to acknowledge. And he cut across the road toward the middle vehicle with his sidearm and the particular kind of focus that lives on the other side of fear. Once you've passed through fear so many times, it just becomes a door you walk through. The middle vehicle's rear hatch was jammed. He shot the hinge. Twice. The hatch came open. There was a girl inside. She was not human. She was Vrothi. Maybe 17, with the pale iridescent scaling of a juvenile, and the hollow-boned build that made all Vrothi look like they'd shatter in a strong wind. She was pressed into the far corner of the transport, with her eyes very wide, and her hands very still, which told him she'd been trained not to move, which told him someone important had trained her. She looked at him like he was the least reassuring thing she had ever seen. Honest reaction, he thought. "Can you run?" he said. She blinked. "Can you run?" He pointed at her feet. He pointed at the tree line. She unfolded herself from the corner and stood. She was almost as tall as him, all legs, like a deer that hadn't finished deciding what it was going to be yet. Her universal standard was accented but clear. "Then we go. Right now." They went. He moved her through the firefight the way you move anything valuable through something dangerous. Body between her and the noise. 2 points of contact at all times. Eyes constantly recalculating. She didn't freeze. She didn't make sound. She kept pace. He adjusted that assessment of her upward significantly. He took a shot in the left shoulder somewhere in the 2nd minute. It felt like being hit with a length of pipe. He kept moving. The math was simple. Stop moving, more pipe. Eventually stop permanently. Not appealing. 3 kilometers of contested terrain. She asked him 11 questions during it. He counted because counting things kept the shoulder in the background. He answered 4. The other 7 were either tactical information he didn't have, or personal questions he wasn't opening on a Tuesday in the middle of a shooting war. The extraction point was a clearing, half a kilometer past the eastern ridge. The UEDF bird was already there, engine running, and the pilot took one look at the two of them, one bleeding human, one alien girl with leaves in her crest, and made the extremely professional decision not to ask anything. They climbed in, the hatch sealed. Dax sat down against the transport wall and pressed his palm against his shoulder, and looked at the ceiling. He could feel the girl watching him. He kept looking at the ceiling. It was a good ceiling, metal, unremarkable. It asked nothing of him. After a while, she said, "You did not fight like a soldier." He kept his eyes on the ceiling. She wasn't wrong. He'd done a dozen things back there that his instructors would have circled in red and written questions next to. Used a body as cover. Rigged a detonation with components from a downed vehicle that were not rated for that use. Shot a door hinge because kicking it was slower. Kept moving through an injury because stopping required math he didn't want to do. None of it was supposed to be. The manual was for soldiers. "No, ma'am," he said. She waited. Soldiers were a luxury. She sat with that for a moment. Then she nodded, once, with the gravity of someone much older. Like she understood exactly what he meant. Like she maybe had her own version of the same sentence. She didn't ask him to explain it. He didn't explain it. His shoulder was bleeding through the field patch, and the engine was loud, and the ceiling was still there, and below them the Yahal corridor was still on fire, and none of that was getting solved in the next 10 minutes, so he closed his eyes. He heard her say, very quietly, in Vrothi, and later Saris would translate it for him, and he would file it away without comment, "I will remember this." He was already half asleep. He did not know yet what that would cost him. The throne room made Dax feel like a thumbtack in a cathedral. Everything was gold and tall and deliberately overwhelming. The kind of architecture that existed to remind you that you were small, and that whoever lived here had decided, a long time ago, that you should feel that way. The ceiling was a mosaic of some battle or creation story. He couldn't tell which, because Vrothi art had a way of looking like both at once. Pillars ran the length of the hall in pairs. The floor was polished to a shine that reflected everyone's feet back at them, which Dax found unsettling for reasons he couldn't name. He stood in his dress uniform, which he'd ironed badly, and waited. The UEDF liaison officer, a man named Pendry who had the look of someone permanently on the verge of the migraine, stood beside him and sweated quietly through his collar. "Do not," Pendry said, "say anything unless directly addressed." "Wasn't planning on it," Dax said. "Do not call her ma'am." "What do I call her?" Pendry told him. It was 6 syllables and involved a throat sound that Dax was physically incapable of making. "I'll do my best," Dax said. Pendry looked at him the way people looked at structural problems they had no budget to fix. The Queen entered. The court changed shape when she came in. Not dramatically. Not the way it happened in old human stories with trumpets and people bowing to the floor. It was more like a room full of tall flames, all leaning the same direction at once. Quiet. Automatic. The Vrothi court adjusting to a gravity they'd grown up inside. Sovereignty ethereal, was tall in the way that made you recalibrate what tall meant. 6 feet and then some, with scaling that had gone deep silver at the edges. Age marking in her species, Saris would explain later, that denoted something between authority and danger. She moved without urgency. She sat in the throne the way rivers sat in riverbeds, like the throne had been built around her and not the other way. She looked at Dax. He looked back. He wasn't trying to be rude. He just didn't know what else to do with his eyes. The ceremony went for 11 minutes. It was, he'd later be told, staggeringly brief by Vrothi standards. A formal recognition of his actions. His name pronounced with perfect accuracy. She'd clearly practiced. And a recitation of what he'd done and why it mattered under Vrathi law. Her voice was low and even, like a road that had been graded flat for 1,000 years. Kale was present, standing to the left of the throne in a formal robe, watching the whole thing with an expression that Dax couldn't read, but that felt, from a distance, like someone watching a door they'd opened and weren't sure yet what was on the other side. When the formal part ended, Ithariel spoke directly to him. "The life of the third heir was preserved through your action," she said. "Universal standard, barely accented, precise as cut glass. Under the Ithkale Compact, which has governed obligation in the Dominion since the founding epoch, the one who preserves royal blood from ending incurs a residency of honor. The preserving party remains within Vrathi jurisdiction until the compact is formally closed." Hendry made a sound beside him. Dax processed the sentence, then processed it again. "How long does the compact stay open?" he asked. The court went very still. He'd addressed her directly, without prompt, using the wrong honorific, which was to say using none at all. Ithariel raised one hand. The stillness hardened, then it softened. Something moved in her face, brief and controlled, like a ripple crossing water, so fast you weren't sure you'd seen it. "The compact closes when I determine it is closed," she said. "The last compact of comparable magnitude concluded in 43 years. 43 years sat in the air of the throne room like something physical." Pendry's color left his face. Ithariel did not look at him. She was still watching Dax. Dax stood there. 43 years. He was 28. That was the math. Simple enough. "Well," he said, "that's something." He was not sure afterward why he said it. It was the first thing that arrived, and it came out before the filter caught it. It was the thing you said when your car broke down on the highway, and you looked at the engine and didn't understand what you were looking at, but couldn't stand the silence. Pendry's intake of breath was quiet enough that only Dax could hear it. Ithariel watched him for 3 seconds that lasted much longer than that. "You are not angry," she said. It was not quite a question. "I don't see how that helps me," Dax said. Another ripple, faster this time. "You will be given quarters in the palace," she said, "appropriate to your status. You will have access to the common areas and the lower library. Movement outside the palace grounds requires escort and formal approval." "Understood," he said. "You have questions." He had about 40. He picked the one that would tell him the most. "Is this a punishment or a law?" She regarded him. Something in her eyes did a complicated thing that he didn't have the vocabulary for yet. "It is a law," she said. "The law makes no distinction between the two." She rose. The court rose with her. The audience was over. Dax said, "Thank you, ma'am." The ripple this time was not controlled. Half the court went rigid. 2 attendants looked at each other. Pendry made a very small, very private sound beside him that was the sound of a man accepting his fate. Ithariel stopped. There was a beat. Long, weighted, hanging. Then she continued walking. That night Dax sat in the middle of an enormous room that was not his, and looked at the ceiling and ran the math again. 43 years was an outside estimate. Probably less. Maybe much less. She'd said that was the last compact of comparable magnitude. Comparable. That word was doing work. He looked at the door. It was locked. Quietly locked. The lock was polite, almost apologetic, but it was there. He stretched out on the floor. The floor was more comfortable than it looked, which he'd take. Put his arm over his eyes and sorted through the arithmetic of where he was versus where he had been 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, he'd been on Station Bravo 9 with a bunk that squeaked and a rotation that repeated itself every 4 weeks and a life shaped exactly like a man waiting for something to happen without believing anything would. Now he had a locked room in an alien palace the size of a small city. He thought about Kale's face during the ceremony, the door she'd opened and wasn't sure about. He thought about what Ethereal's eyes had done when he said he wasn't angry. He put both thoughts in a drawer in the back of his mind and closed it. His cultural attaché was a mid-rank Vrothi official named Saris, who had the look of someone who had volunteered for this assignment in a moment of professional optimism, and was now living inside the consequences. Saris was organized. Saris had documents. Saris showed up at Dax's quarters every morning at the same time, with a schedule and a list of things that Dax was or was not allowed to do that day. And he presented these lists with the energy of someone reading safety instructions on a life raft. Sincere, urgent, slightly desperate. Dax listened to all of it. Then he asked questions. "Why does your military announce its plans before it moves?" Dax asked on the second day. Saris blinked. "It is a formal declaration of engagement. It tells the enemy you are serious. It also tells them where you're going to be." Saris opened his mouth, closed it, wrote something in his notes. "Why does the council chamber have windows?" Dax asked on the fourth day. "The windows face a wall." "The windows represent openness to. They're not for looking through." "No. Then they're decoration. They are symbolic." "Right," Dax said. "Who actually makes the decisions in there? Because I watched the session yesterday, and the Prime Minister spoke most, but 3 other people kept looking at each other before anything was approved." Saris filed his 9th report in 2 weeks. Ithariel read it, as she read all of them in the hour before her morning audiences. She made one note in her own hand at the bottom: correct on all counts. She did not explain what she meant by that to anyone. Months moved slowly when you had nowhere to be. Dax built a routine the way you build anything when you're bored. Not because you plan to, but because your hands start doing things before your brain approves them. Morning. The palace gardens, where the plants were improbable shapes and colors, but smelled, in the early quiet, not entirely unlike the hills back home. Midday. The lower library. Afternoon, whatever Saris had scheduled, which ranged from formal protocol lessons to standing in rooms while things happened around him. Evening, the map room, which wasn't a room for maps specifically, but had a long table and wasn't frequently used and had the best ceiling in the east wing. He was in the gardens on a morning 6 weeks in, when Kale found him. She was supposed to be in instruction. He could tell because she was wearing the formal crest binding that Vrothi students of her rank wore during lessons, which meant she had left instructions specifically, which meant she was either very brave or very unconcerned with consequences. Probably both. She sat on the stone ledge across from him, without asking if she could. He respected that too. "Tell me what happened," she said. "In the corridor." He told her the tactical version: vehicle counts, breach point, extraction route, time on the ground. Clean and factual. The kind of debrief that had a shape and stayed inside it. She waited until he was done. "That is not what I am asking," she said. He looked at her. She looked back. She had her mother's eyes, not the color, but the quality, the thing that saw angles and waited. He was quiet for a long time. The garden was quiet with him. Then he gave her 6 sentences about what it felt like to move through something dangerous with another person's life between you and the noise, about the math you ran when the math was the only thing keeping the rest of it out, about the way your body learned, after enough time, to move before your brain asked it to, and how that was useful, and also, in the wrong moments, a problem. He did not explain what the wrong moments were. He did not mention Kepler Station. The 6 sentences said everything about Kepler Station without saying the name once. She sat with those 6 sentences for a while. "Thank you," she said. He nodded. She came back the next morning, and the next. By the 3rd week it was a habit that neither of them named, because naming it would have made it a thing that could be ended. They talked about tactics, about history. She knew her people's history the way you knew a house you'd grown up in, every corner and creak of it. She asked him questions about human military doctrine, and he answered some of them honestly, and some of them with the particular vagueness of someone who had signed documents about what he could share. She caught the vagueness every time, and didn't push. She was 17, and already understood the shape of a door someone wasn't opening. 4 months in, the compound had a problem. A Karathi agent came through the east perimeter in the early hours. Small operation. A probe. In and out. Test the response times. Map the gaps. 2 Karathi guards were injured on the inner residential approach. The intruder reached the 3rd corridor before Dax came out of the map room. He was not armed. Palace restriction. He'd been unarmed for 4 months, which was a condition he'd accepted the way you accepted weather, with low-grade irritation and no real alternative. He intercepted the intruder with nothing but what he had, which was a working knowledge of the corridor's geometry, the weight of a stone decorative urn that had always bothered him by being in the wrong place, and the deeply inconvenient fact that 3 years of grief and displacement had left him with very little regard for his own structural integrity. The after-action report described it as unconventional physical resolution of the incursion. The footnote was classified. Ithuriel called for him the next morning. She was standing when he entered the smaller receiving room, a room with a window and a table and 2 seats, which felt, in its own way, more significant. "You are unarmed," she said. "Yes, ma'am." And yet, "Yes, ma'am." She regarded him the way you regarded a mathematical equation that kept producing the right answer through a method you couldn't follow. "What are you, Specialist Mercer?" The question had weight. It was not a small question. It was the question under the question under the question, and they both knew it. "A man with a lot of free time and nowhere to be," he said. She was quiet for a moment. "Dismissed," she said. He left. She stood at the window for a long time after. In the library that afternoon, he found a record of the Ithkale Compact's previous applications. It took him 3 hours to locate, because the Vrati filing system was organized by a logic he'd spent weeks learning. There were 2 prior cases. Both ended in under 3 years. Both occurred during periods of significant political pressure on the Dominion. He sat with that information for a long time. Then he pulled a record on the Karathi separatist movement's territorial history. Then another on the contested zones of the Yahal corridor over the past decade. He built the shape of something slowly, the way you build a picture from the wrong end. Small pieces, wrong order, gradually becoming something you recognize. He didn't like what he recognized. He asked Saris offhandedly the next morning about the current state of Karathi claims in the corridor. Saris went quiet in the way of something mechanical that has been switched off. "That is a political matter outside your access clearance," Saris said. "Sure," Dax said. He folded the information away and didn't take it out again where anyone could see it. That evening he sat alone in the map room and looked at the ceiling, and thought about the fact that the Queen of the Varathi Dominion had used a 43-year legal instrument to keep a single mid-ranked UEDF specialist in her palace during what appeared, from the pieces he'd assembled, to be the early movement of a very serious and very specific threat. He thought about Kale, her questions, the way she'd listened to his 6 sentences. He thought about the word comparable. He wrote a letter to the UEDF liaison office. 3 paragraphs, careful. The 3rd paragraph was a specific, quiet request for any available intelligence on Karathi activity in the Yahal corridor over the past 18 months. He sealed it. He sent it through Saris, who accepted it without comment. Then he went back to looking at the ceiling. The intelligence file arrived on a Tuesday, tucked inside a routine supply notation, which meant Pendry was either smarter than he looked or genuinely terrified. Dax unfolded it in the map room with the door closed and read it twice. The second reading was for the parts he'd hoped he'd misread the first time. He sat for 4 minutes. 4 minutes was how long it took to move through the first wave of that particular feeling, the one that lived at the junction of being right about something and wishing with everything you had that you weren't. He'd felt it before. He knew its shape. He let it pass through and out the other side, and then he stood up. He went to find Ethereal. She received him in the same smaller room with the window and the table, the one that felt like a real room. He put the file on the table and laid out what he knew in the flattest, most clinical voice he had, which was very flat and very clinical, because he'd built it that way over years for exactly this kind of moment. The Karathi ambush in the Yahal corridor had not been a separatist operation. Separatists did not have the resources for three-pronged coordinated strikes with pre-positioned agents. The convoy's route had been leaked from inside the Dominion's logistics chain. That part was in the file. One line, quietly enormous. The target had not been the convoy. The target had been Kale specifically, third in succession. Her death during an apparent border skirmish would trigger a succession dispute between the first and second heirs, both of whom had different factional support in the Dominion Council. The fracture would take years to resolve. The Karathi needed years. The ambush had failed. That did not mean the campaign had stopped. It meant it had gone quiet to recalibrate. Ethereal listened. She sat with her hands folded on the table and her eyes on the middle distance just past his left shoulder, not avoiding him, just looking at the full shape of the information rather than his face. She was quiet, the way mountains were quiet. Absolute and with weight. When he finished, she said, "Yes, just that." The word arrived and kept arriving for several seconds. "You knew," he said. "I suspected." "When?" "Before the compact." He went still. The specific stillness of a man who understood exactly what the sentence meant, and was choosing, very deliberately, not to move while he decided what to do with it. He'd been kept here, not by gratitude, not by law in the way he'd understood it, by calculation. "You needed something in the palace," he said, not a question. "I needed something the Karathi had no answer for," she said. Her voice had not changed. It was still the low, even road. "Their doctrine is precise. Their intelligence is thorough. They study military movement the way a scholar studies text. They know our formations, our response patterns, our traditions. They knew the convoy route. They knew the escort protocol." She paused. "They did not know what to do with you." "So you locked me in your house?" "I gave you quarters and library access. And a lock on the door." She didn't deny it. He stood there and let the anger come. It was familiar and useful, and it held everything else at arm's length, which was what he needed from it right now. The particular fury of being moved around a board without consent, that was clean. That was a thing he could hold. "You could have asked," he said. The words came out quieter than he intended. Quiet was sometimes worse. "Would you have stayed?" she said. He opened his mouth, closed it. The honest answer was no. 2 weeks ago, the honest answer was no. Before the library and the garden and the map room, and 6 sentences in the morning, and a girl who listened the way people only listened when they were deciding whether to trust you. Before Ceres and his 9 reports, and the ceiling and the particular shape the light made in the east wing in the late afternoon. Before he'd started to give a damn. The answer was still no, and they both understood that the no was wrong, that the no would have meant something that hadn't happened here would have been allowed to happen. He was furious about that. He was also standing in a room where the math kept doing the same thing, no matter how he arranged the pieces. He said nothing. "What is the timeline?" he said finally. 12 days, possibly less. "Show me." She spread a tactical map on the table. He studied it for a long time, pulling the intelligence file next to it, cross-referencing the movement patterns, the likely staging points, the entry corridors. The Karathi plan had 3 parts. Infrastructure. Hit the communication relay in the northern sector, create noise and confusion. Court infiltration. An agent already inside, waiting for a signal. Direct extraction of Kale, disguised as a rescue operation during the chaos of the first 2. It was good. It was genuinely well designed. He spent several minutes appreciating it, the way you appreciated a machine someone had built well, even when the machine was meant to hurt you. "I need Ceres," he said. I need his clearance upgraded. He needs to be able to give orders to the security detail in the east and north wings directly. Ethereal nodded. I need 2 days, access to this room and everything in it. Done. And the compact. We can discuss. I'm not discussing it now, he said. I'm discussing the 12 days. The other thing waits. She looked at him. Something in her eyes adjusted, the way a lens adjusts to bring something into focus. Agreed, she said. He didn't forgive her. He pulled a chair up to the map table and started working. Those two things existed inside him at the same time, without canceling each other out. That was not comfortable. It was also, in his experience, exactly what living felt like when you were paying attention. Kale found him at 2 in the morning. He heard her before she appeared in the doorway. She had a distinctive step, 3 quick and 1 slower, which she'd had since the corridor, and which he'd never mentioned. She looked at the map, then at him. She told you, Kale said. I figured it out, he said. Kale came in and sat across from him at the table. She didn't touch the map. She folded her hands, the way her mother folded hands, which she probably didn't know she did. Are you going to leave? She asked. Her voice was even. She'd worked to make it even. He could hear the work. He looked at the map. After, he said. She nodded once. She looked at the map. The relay station in the north, she said. There is a secondary access route that is not on any official diagram. I found it when I was 12. I used to use it to get to the roof. He looked at her. She looked at the map with the face of someone being very helpful and not doing anything else. Show me, he said. She pointed. He drew the line. They worked until the first gray light of morning came in through the window. 2 people in a map room, in the quiet, building something that had to hold. At some point, Saris appeared in the doorway with a tray of something hot, and left it on the side table without speaking. Dax made a note to upgrade his assessment of Saris significantly. When the work was done, Dax put his jacket over his face and slept on the floor. Kale sat at the table and looked at the map and listened to him breathe and did not say what she was thinking. The Karathi were moving. They had 12 days, and a plan, and they didn't know that the thing they hadn't planned for was already awake in the palace, waiting. It started with the relay station. The Northern Communications relay went dark at 0300, exactly when the intelligence said it would, which was useful because it confirmed the timeline, and unsettling because it confirmed the timeline. Dax was already in the North Corridor when it happened, which was where he'd told Saris he'd be, and Saris had the security detail moving before the alarm finished its first cycle. That was the first surprise the Karathi ran into. Their operation assumed a 12-minute response from the North Wing. They got 4. Dax didn't watch that part. He was already somewhere else. The inner route Kale had shown him, the one not on any official diagram, used by a 12-year-old looking for the roof, ran through the east maintenance passage behind the council chambers, and came out 30 meters from the communication junction. It was low-ceilinged and smelled like old stone, and was not built for someone his size. He moved through it anyway, hunched and fast, with the particular economy of motion he'd learned on Kepler Station, where economy was the difference between here and not here. He didn't think about Kepler Station. He thought about the junction, the map, the 12 faces he'd memorized from the file, and the way the passage turned left twice before it straightened. The infiltration agent was waiting at the junction. She was good, genuinely good. She'd been inside the palace for 3 months, and she'd done nothing visibly wrong in 3 months, which required a patience Dax had professional respect for. She had the correct uniform, the correct credentials, and a blade designed to look like a standard tool. She had not been briefed on him specifically. This was the Karathi's fundamental problem. They had deep intelligence on the Varathi. They had files on the palace guard, the council, the security rotations. They had mapped every significant variable in the Dominion's defensive posture. He was not in their files. It was over in about 40 seconds. He used the passage wall, the low ceiling, and the fact that she expected a fight to look a particular way. It looked wrong and messy, and entirely effective. He secured her. He reported to Saris. He moved. The third part, the extraction attempt on Kale, was the one he'd spent the most time on in the map room. It was also the best designed piece of the Karathi operation, and the one with the most variables. They were going to come in from the garden-facing side, using the servant entrance that opened during early morning supply deliveries. They were going to move fast, and they were going to have the chaos of the relay failure and the court infiltration as cover. Except Kale had locked down the inner palace 2 hours before, using a failsafe system she'd found in the library records 8 months ago, and mentioned to Dax in the garden 3 weeks back, casually, the way she mentioned things that turned out to matter. And the failsafe sealed every garden-facing entrance from the inside, with locks that required 3 simultaneous council-level authorizations to open. The extraction team reached the garden entrance and found a door that would not move. They tried the secondary entry point. Dax was there. He was still not armed in any formal sense. He had the things on him that he always had, which were mostly not classified as weapons by anyone's definition, except the one formed by watching what he could do with them. He had the layout of this section of the garden because he'd walked it every morning for 8 months, which was long enough to know where the light came from and where the ground dipped, and which planters were heavy stone and which were hollow. The after-action report for this engagement would later note that the Karathi extraction team of 6 had been neutralized by a single UEDF specialist using what the report called environmental improvisation and non-standard physical engagement. It noted that the specialist sustained 2 additional injuries. It noted that the specialist continued operating through both. The report was required reading in Karathi military academies for 200 years. The footnote said only, human. When it was done, the garden was very quiet. Dax sat down on the ground next to one of the heavy stone planters because his leg had decided it was done. He looked up at the sky. It was still dark, but the very edge of the east was doing something that would be dawn in an hour. His shoulder was a problem. The old wound, not fully healed, had opinions. His ribs had opinions. His leg had already expressed its opinion, and he'd noted it. He sat there and breathed, and looked at the almost dawn, and didn't think about anything specific. Later he would not be able to explain the exact quality of that moment. The quiet that arrived after. It wasn't peace. He didn't reach for that word. It was more like the particular absence that came when you'd done the thing that needed doing, and the next thing hadn't started yet. And you were just in the space between, and the space between was, for once, not full of anything you had to keep out. Saris found him there, said nothing, sat down on the ground nearby, in a way that was probably undignified by every standard of his culture, and clearly didn't care. They sat together until the edge of the sky turned pink. 3 days later, Ithariel summoned him. The throne room again. The cathedral ceiling, the twin pillars, the floor that reflected everyone's feet. He'd stopped noticing the size of it months ago, which was either adaptation or defeat, and he decided not to figure out which. She was standing. He noticed that immediately. Everyone noticed it immediately. Saris at his shoulder went very still, in the way of something that has just encountered something outside its known categories. The sovereignty of the Vrathi dominion did not stand to receive. She stood. The Ithkael Compact, she said, is formally closed. Under my authority as sovereignty of the dominion, I declare the obligation concluded and release all claims. The room was quiet. You are free to depart. He stood there. He stood there for longer than was easy to explain. Free to depart. Actually open. Not the performed openness of the past 8 months, but the real kind. The kind you could walk through right now with nobody stopping you, and nobody running the math on what that cost. He looked at the ceiling. Then at Kale. She was standing near the left pillar, and she was visibly, aggressively looking at a point on the far wall, which was the most precise neutrality he'd ever seen on a face, and which told him everything about what she was hoping for. Then, at Ithariel, she was watching him the way she'd watched him in the smaller room with the window, looking at the whole shape of a thing rather than just its face. I would, she said, extend an additional offer, separate from the compact. Under no legal instrument, the Dominion has no position for a human tactical liaison. I am prepared to create one. The position would carry full diplomatic standing, full access to the library and tactical archives, and the right to leave at any time, for any reason. She paused. No lock on the door. The room held its breath. Dax looked at the throne room floor, at his own reflection looking back up at him from the polished stone, small and slightly disheveled, and standing in the middle of a room that had been built to make people feel small. He didn't feel small. He hadn't felt small in 8 months, which was something he was only now calculating. He thought about Kepler Station. He let himself think about it directly, which he hadn't done in 3 years, which was its own kind of information. 4 people, a mission that went wrong in the specific way that wrong missions went when you were the only one who came back. The particular shape of existing afterward, as a man waiting for something, without believing anything was coming. He wasn't waiting anymore. That was the thing. Somewhere in the last 8 months, in the library, and the garden, and the map room, and 6 sentences, and a girl who found a route that wasn't on any diagram, the waiting had stopped. That was maybe how it was supposed to go. I'll need a real room, he said, not the East Wing one. Already identified, Ithariel said, and full library access, not the lower section. Granted. And I'm going to keep calling you ma'am. A pause. The very slight movement in her face that he'd learned over 8 months was the version of a smile that she allowed herself in formal settings. I have, she said, fully resigned myself to this. Kale made a sound, very small. She covered it immediately by adjusting her robe. Dax said, okay then. He stayed. The throne room went on around him, officials moving and voices beginning again, the machinery of the Dominion resuming its ordinary motion. Saris appeared at his elbow, with the look of a man who had just lived through several things, and needed to sit down, but was going to do his job first. I'll need to file approximately 40 documents, Saris said. Sure, Dax said. The position doesn't technically exist yet. I will need to. Saris, yes. File the documents. I'll be in the library. Saris looked at him. Something settled in his face that had been unsettled since the first morning, weeks and weeks ago, when Dax had asked why the windows didn't look through anything, and broken something loose in the way Saris understood his own job. Yes, specialist, Saris said, and then, with the deliberate precision of a man doing something new, welcome. Dax walked out of the throne room and down the long corridor toward the library, with his hands in his pockets and his shoulders still complaining, and the morning light coming in at the far end of the hall in a long pale stripe across the floor. He walked